Okay, I hope everybody can hear me. I don't have a microphone. I usually have no problem. But when we did Confirmation Rewind or Reboot, whatever it was, a few months ago, I did something similar. And an elderly friend of mine arrived late, sat in the back row, and then chewed me out later because he hadn't heard me. Well, I don't think he put his hearing aid in, and he didn't say, "Sir, sir, sir," or even, "Hey, you." He just sat there and stewed. So don't sit there and stew. Please tell me if you can't hear me, if you don't know what I'm saying, if you don't understand, or if you just think you have better things to say than I do. And what I want to do is introduce myself first. Patrick Gray. I am an Anglican priest, though I try and keep that under wraps as much as possible. I was a curate at St. Simon's Church in Toronto, but I got hooked with the bug of the history of theology, history of doctrine, when I was doing my divinity degree, and I went on. So my main career has been in university teaching. That's where I made my money. But I've almost always been an honorary assistant somewhere. I've taught at University of Toronto, York University, and McMaster. At McMaster, interestingly enough, I was teaching in the Baptist Divinity College. So I've got the scars to prove it. Anyway, I've been around. And I have been engaged in a lifelong struggle with the mystery of God and therefore of religion. And I guess I should say I am a bona fide liberal. Shoot now and we can get on with it. Nope, no shots, good. But by being liberal, I mean that, first off, I think that the mystery that we're dealing with is so enormous and so far beyond comprehension that everything we say is an attempt to put into words something at that moment in time with the intellectual equipment we have, the culture that we live in, and so on. And that changes over time. I have let myself face what some other people would deal with differently. A liberal faces things and says, I'll take my chances. You know, if I look at this modern way of looking at things, it may be so dangerous that it will destroy my faith. But I'm a grown-up, I'm a real human being, I'm living in these times, and these are the questions. I really should face them head on and take my chances. I've taken my chances. I'm still here, battered, bruised, and different, because I've been through that for all those long years of my adult life. Thinking through and rethinking and finding new words to put things in. I know that there's another and respectable way to deal with those things, which is to say we're going to put these things in a safe place and tell ourselves we shouldn't be asking those questions. It will keep the sacred and protected. That's a good strategy too, but it's not mine. Maybe yours. Okay, so what we're going to do today is not really, of course, the topic. That would be silly. Nobody ever follows the topic they're given. And I might as well confess right away. I thought I was here to talk about difficult doctrines. So if that's okay, let's do that. Okay, let me talk a bit, and then I'm just going to ask you to ask me questions or to raise issues that we can discuss about doctrines. As I say, go back. I've spent my professional career, my research career, written my books, whatever I've done, has been about the history of doctrine. So I know quite a bit about what happened 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, even into the 7th. 20th, 21st, I just visit on occasion. But I know a lot about the history of doctrine, which means I know that it developed, that it changed. That they found new words over those centuries for things. I wanted to cite an example from our sister faith of Judaism. You know, the story of Exodus, the famous story when they come out and they cross through the Sea of Reeds and the Egyptians drown. And their chariots and horses and everybody. And then Miriam and Joseph, how did I get Joseph into there? Moses. But Miriam sings and dances. The Lord has triumphed. Sometime in the 19th century, I think, maybe 18th, a rabbi thought about this. And he said, you know what actually happened? They came through, the Egyptians were drowned, and Miriam began to dance. And God said, how can you dance and rejoice when my children lie dead at the bottom of the sea? And the notion of God expands. It's not just the God of Israel, but the God of all people. And therefore the Egyptians too are God's children. That's wise. That's real progress. That's the kind of deepening of doctrine that you can have if you let yourselves adventure into facing the questions and thinking deeply about them. And being humble, saying, I will do what I can to try and put into words what is too big a mystery for me. Another example of how I've changed in thinking. We all know that there has been such a thing in the church as calling human beings as deeply depraved, infected by original sin from Adam and Eve's fall. I had a shock when I was teaching one of my first courses ever at York University, and a colleague who was doing the Old Testament part of it, what he would call the Jewish Bible, a rabbi, said, I'm going to talk about the Adam and Eve story. He said, of course, we don't think that's a story about the fall. We don't think that's a fall. Or if it's a fall up. He said, think about the story. Adam and Eve are children at the beginning in the Garden of Eden, and then they eat the apple and they begin to know good and evil. But that just means wrestling with the problems of goodness and badness. How can I be good? How can I avoid being bad? So they become adults, he said in that story. And in Judaism, he said, we think of human beings as adults alongside an adult God, and you argue back and forth. You know, and in Judaism, you do argue with God. Why did you do this to me? Well, of course, Jesus was Jewish, though only on his mother's side, of course. And I'm glad you laughed. But Jesus says, why have you forsaken me? You know, and so that opens up a whole lot of new insights into how you might interpret these things. And we might recognize, as I did being a historian over the time, that the Eastern Orthodox churches don't believe in original sin. They don't believe everybody's affected. They think that God created human beings, and human beings began to struggle and go wrong, and that's part of the progress, and eventually Jesus came to enlighten them and to lead them back into the right path. That leads me to another thing that I've come to think, that I think is a wonderful change, but a huge change when you think about it, and that is the insight, and it comes from some people who are thinking in the 20th, 21st century, that we've got it a little bit wrong if we make our first story the story of fallenness, the story of brokenness. Because it's not the first story in the Bible. And so people have written books with the title like Original Blessing. And when I saw that, I thought to myself, yes, this is where I was struggling for. This is where I wanted to go. The big story is God's creation and the blessedness of that gift. and its potential for goodness, all the goodness that's there that can be realized, and the whole adventure that God gave us to become more and more His people so that we become the kingdom of God, that was all gift and wonderful. And our first reaction is not, oh Lord, how terrible we are, but oh, how wonderful the way we've been made, and how wonderful the world that God has given us. And then sin and fallenness are where we go wrong. We go off the path. But that's a detour from the huge, wonderful highway that our feet were upon. It's just a glitch. So original blessing and the real reality of sin and diversion, but it's not the main story. The main story is wonderful and delightful and full of grace. Okay, there are lots of other things I could talk about. I could confess to you, maybe I should, that sometimes in my struggle to keep on thinking and being a fully 20th, 21st century even, well, I'm not 21st century, I'm too old for that. 20th century human being. In that struggle, I've had doubts. Doubts are not necessarily bad things. Doubts are the impetus to think again. To think again. Try a different way of putting it. Try a different way of being, even. Doubts are all right. But there have been times when I stopped going to church, even, for a while. So we do that too, clergy. Don't worry. But I've always found a way to come back, and I've always found myself being called to come back. And so now I'm back, and I'm at St. Mark's in that other town whose name is not mentioned in Cobourg. It's all right, we don't talk about Cobourg either, not when we're at home. Sorry, that's an old joke around here. And I'm helping out at St. Mark's and preaching and running a book club, and we do a Taizé service. So those are the kinds of things I do. And I'm writing a last academic book, which is so obscure, you don't want to know anything about it. I'll just tell you it's in the 5th century. And amongst the small coterie of people who think that stuff is interesting enough to get the background to understand it, it's going to be a blockbuster. Universal Studios are after the film rights as we speak. Yeah, after the success of my Leontius of Jerusalem against the Monophysites, it's a runaway success. Yeah. I've written several books and I think I made $1,000 altogether. That's how much. Okay, but we're here to talk about difficult doctrines, and that can cover a lot of things, but what's troubling you? Please, somebody say something. Yes?
I would like to think of the Bible as the manual for life instruction, but I have a problem when you're supposed to look at the Bible as something that has the way you're supposed to live, and yet it contradicts each other from how we are, and people misquote things so that, you know, if you're talking about homosexuality, it's an abomination, but we've got Leviticus in there, where an eye for eye, a tooth for tooth, capital punishment, you know, make the woman go in the backyard in a tent when she's having her period. So do we follow those rules if we're going to follow the other rules? Or how do you reconcile what's in the Bible when it depends which side you want to take in an argument? This says it in the Bible, but this says it in the Bible too.
Yeah. The Bible, well, you know, we are all confused by it because we have it as one book. But before the 4th century, the Bible, there was no such thing as the Bible. There were scrolls. Different scrolls.
So should we believe in certain scrolls?
Well, you would pick the scrolls, and this still happens in the synagogue. You pick the scroll that speaks to your need at the time. And the Bible to me is full of contradictions and tensions. I go back to what I said at the beginning. God is an enormous mystery. To talk about a mystery everything you say is going to be a contradiction of something else. You can't talk about anything that big in a single sentence. Paul Tillich said, when you talk about ultimate truth, it's fractured into antinomies. That's just a fussy way of saying that it breaks down into contradictions. God is good, and yet God is fierce with people, and we might not think that was good. Think about St. Paul, and you've got what I think are his real letters, the ones he actually wrote, and the ones that were written by disciples of his in a later generation under difficult and different circumstances, the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And Paul himself is living at a moment when Christianity is a radical underground movement. And like other radical underground movements, it's egalitarian, men and women working together. Paul writes to females as colleagues in mission, as deacons. Don't be fooled by the translation of uptight 19th century translators that said it was deaconess. It's not. There were women who were deacons and apostles, and even according to some of the frescoes, we've got at least one fresco of a woman celebrating the Eucharist, way back from the 2nd or 3rd century. But anyway, you got Paul in a radical moment, and then a disciple writing middle of the 2nd century when Christianity's been persecuted for 100 years, and they want to look presentable to the world and say, no, we're decent, upstanding citizens. We wash our cars and we cut our grass, and we don't let our grass grow into wild flower lawns. I know in Cobourg you're not allowed to have those. And so in the pastorals, you get Paul, someone pretending to be Paul, saying, wives obey your husbands, children obey your parents, the young obey the old, slaves follow your masters, all of that stuff. Because that's what they needed then. So one thing I'd say is that different parts of the Bible speak to different moments. There was, the Reformation with Martin Luther, then it was all Paul, and the Epistle to the Romans. But at another time, it might be John, it might be Luke. Oh, you want to worry about making people pay the church and give all their money to the church? Then, Luke, who writes the book of Acts, where, what's his name, and Sapphira pretend they've given all their money to the church but haven't, and they get hit by lightning and they're dead. Now, I haven't yet needed to use that. Not many sermons on that topic. But if St. Peter's mortgage continues to be as big as it is, you may start to hear sermons on that. Okay? So that's one thing I'd say about it, is that you just simply do look for the place that nourishes and enriches and deepens your experience. And it's not going to be the same as the text that worked for your great-grandmother or your great-grandfather.
So if somebody says they believe in taking the word of the Bible as the absolute, they're not meaning the whole Bible, they're picking out what books.
Everybody has to pick. Everybody has to pick, yeah. But the thing to say about the Bible, too, is that because it's a whole bunch of different scrolls, it's like recombinant DNA. You can put this with this, with this, with this, and you get this pattern. You say, oh, that's what being an authentic church person means. But 50 years later, say, thinking of myself in my 70s, coming around to something later on, and I'll go and recombine them in a different pattern that speaks more deeply to me and more authentically. So I think that's the benefit of it. The benefit of the diversity. It's not like the prophet, there's only one Muhammad who's had only one Quran. We don't have just one. We have multiple viewpoints. And if you think of God as like a diamond, then people are looking at different facets of that diamond at different times and in different books. Does that help?
Yep, thank you.
Good. Yes, sir. I'll come over here just a sec.
History Channel runs a series called Ancient Aliens. Has the notion that God was an alien visitor to our planet ever entered into your thoughts?
Not for long.
I had that.
Yeah.
It's entered into my
You know,
thoughts.
but do you remember Chariots of the Gods? Yes. Yeah, which said you look at these big patterns. It had to be an alien coming from space to see it. But you know, most of that stuff, they just missed the obvious, which is that, of course, they thought that the sun was a god. And so, of course, they did things in big patterns for the sun to look at. It doesn't take aliens to explain a lot of things. Doesn't mean I don't think aliens exist somewhere in the world, and I must say I speculate what kind of religion do they have. But with any luck, I'll be dead and gone before that's tested. Okay, someone over here.
Back to the question of the First Lady.
Mhm.
Do you think that there needs to be a structure to interpreting the Bible then? Like, it feels like it's just all out there, we just pick and choose unless there's some kind of ways to interpret, like exegesis and hermeneutics and that kind of thing. Should we be looking at those ways, that approach to the Bible, instead of, like, some people have very literary, totally literary.
Do you mean literal?
Literal, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. Just want to be sure.
Interpretation, and then there are those who are more literal.
I don't know about should. I mean, I've spent my life as a historian. I cannot help looking at it historically and seeing the evidence. And this is, let's face it, this is one of the great traumas of the modern church, is that scholars have applied the methods used for any historical document to these sacred documents. So, of course, troubling things have come of that. And we're still in the process of that. So I can't tell you what should happen. I can tell you that I can't help, as a modern, looking at them historically. I can't help concluding that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their model and added and took away things. I can't help thinking, I mean, I remember my professor, Father Bayer at Trinity College 50 years ago, with his Greek New Testament and his cataracts. He would go around like this, and going through in Greek the Epistle to the Ephesians and saying, "Oh, you're using it wrong. Look at the word he uses here. Paul never would have said that. Paul couldn't say that," and he's absolutely right. All you have to do is look at the huge long sentences in Ephesians. The translation is stuck in periods, but there are sentences that go on for almost a page. Has to be a different person from the punchy street-fighting Paul that we know from the authentic letters. We write short, easily accessible things in Demotic Greek, you know, the Greek of the street. Yeah, Paul uses very bad language at times. You know, when in the translation you read, he's thinking about his past in Judaism, and he says, "I count it all as," I think that the translation says refuse. But he says it's crap. Yeah, it's a street word. Could be.
It helps to know those things.
Yeah, of course it does. I think we just have to adventure into it. And we're still wrestling with it. I think it's really, really difficult to try and put everything together. In fact, I think it's impossible. So I say to my friends who say, "Well, I'm a theologian," I say, "Oh, so you're one of those people who want to F the ineffable." Or you can change it and say, "Scrut the inscrutable." But, you know, it really is extraordinarily, when you think about it, it's comically hubristic to say, "I can give you a complete picture." You can't. Or I don't think you can. I certainly can't. I wrestle with the bits and the pieces. And so, does that answer your question? Best I can do. Yes, sir.
Can you give us a bit of the history of the creeds?
Creeds. Yeah. Friend of mine, radical woman Anglican priest out West, she's just come back to Ontario, Judy Levens, pointed out to her congregation that the creeds were written either for you to subscribe to when you were baptized, which is where the Apostles' Creed, so-called, comes from. It's the Roman baptismal creed. Or the Creed of Nicaea is a creed created at a time of crisis when the church could go this way or that way on whether Jesus was the embodiment of God or was just the best of the creatures, as the Arians said. So you create a creed to close that off and say, no, the God side. Trudy said to her congregation, and I think rightly, creeds were made for those great big moments. Why are we saying them every Sunday? You know, I think it in fact gives us, this is where I get stroppy a bit, I think that if we're going to have the creed every week, we should sing it. And the reason I think we should sing it, I used to hold exactly the opposite opinion, so I respect the opposite opinion. Sensible people have had it, but I don't have it anymore. I think we should sing it because singing comes from a different part of the brain. Comes from the heart, and what it's about, then the word I believe, or we believe, if you go back to the original Greek for that, and here I can pull rank on most of you and just pretend to know Greek and fool you. The original word means I trust. Pisteo, I trust. So we trust. And if you think of it, stories that we put our faith in, rather than propositions that we assent to, makes quite a different thing of it, doesn't it? Or you might think of it as a poem. It's a poem, and a poem speaks truth, but not in propositional form, not in this is the case, this is how it is, but helps you to feel and respond to it. So I think that we have a kind of, we've distorted the nature of religious life by making the creed such a big part of weekly worship. Because religion mostly is not about propositions we believe, but about how we are. What we do, how we relate to each other, ritual actions that we take that have poetic meaning. I think that we overlay it with too much. Here's a professor saying a silly thing, shooting himself in the foot. You know, all this brain stuff, all this intellectualization of things, all of this trying to capture it in words that are exactly precise, has really distorted it. And again, I think of one of my rabbi friends who said, you know, religion in the ancient world, say, what's Judaism about? Oh, it's about wearing certain clothes, eating certain foods, having certain practices, how you cut your hair, what you say when you meet in a group, how you pray. But it wasn't about what you believe. Judaism has a theology today only in the countries where it's trying to compete with Christianity.
I think it's interesting you say that it's good to sing the creed because we would never say the national anthem, would we?
No, and for a similar reason.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a useful comment. Yeah, yes, ma'am.
The question is, if you had your way, what would be the perfect church service that you'd like to see?
Oof. Can I plead the fifth? No, I'll tell you what I would like to see. First off, I would like to get the confessional stuff over with first. We're allowed to do that. That's right there in the prayer book with a little penitential rite, because I think it's hugely over-emphatic about sin, and you just begin to get cheerful and then you're back confessing again. And I mean, something like Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world, have mercy upon us, have mercy. The works of mercy are manifold. You know, they're not just forgiveness, but it all gets tied to sin. So we're absolutely obsessed by sin and by feeling awful about ourselves. And this goes back again to that whole business about original sin and fallenness. I would like to see us go from that, as we do with the Gloria. The Gloria is wonderful. I don't know how you do it in your church, but the music we use at St. Mark's is upbeat. and makes you really feel good. And I would like to see a Eucharistic prayer that's centered on creation. I would like to see not just prayers of the people, but thanksgivings. Overpowering the prayers, overpowering the sinfulness with celebration. I would like it to be a celebration. I would like it to be happier, because I am happy. I am happy because I've been given my life. I'm happy because I've been given the world. I'm happy because of God's generous and overflowing nature from whom all of this comes, and the blessedness to which we are called in the future. I mean, what's not to like? What's not to be happy about? I'm glad I modified the prayer of humble access a little bit. But that really was, a friend of mine used to call that the lowly worm.
Yeah, I have a friend who calls it the prayer of humble excess.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, does that help? That would be the kind of service I would like. I every now and then think I'm going to go and write one, and then I squander my talents on something else. Yes?
Yeah, going into the Bible again, you know, like, from the first time they were written until now, they're changed. Like, you know, every time somebody writes it, they change it, you know, or a change is made to it. So, like, if I tell you a story, it goes around here, but it's not about here, it's different.
Yeah, of course it is. Stories change in the telling. We demonstrated this once at the university, or a colleague of mine did. He gave the person at the end of the row here a little text, a familiar text, almost, and then it passed it on to the next person. What came out at the end was, roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. But what he'd put in here was, roses are red, violets are blue, you've got a nose like a B-52. Now, what that demonstrates is that in the passing down of things, the really difficult things often get smothered by people thinking, oh, he can't have said that, can't have said anything so offensive as that. And I don't have a nose like a B-52. No, it must mean that sugar is sweet and so am I. You know, so that's an example of the way things change. Yeah.
As a historian that you study this stuff, I'm just starting to understand a bit more about it. Are there things that you've studied or whatever that should be in the Bible of today that aren't? Like, I just get the idea sometimes that the Bible's been edited to certain things because we don't want the people to know some of the so-called, you know, good stuff that should have been in there.
Well, there's an opportunity. Point number one, the canon, that means the rule about the New Testament, has never been closed officially. Point number two, it was only in the 4th century that we got our first list by any early Christian writer of all the books that we now have in the Christian Bible. Everybody else had some variations. Other things were in that we don't have. A lot of things were out that we now do have. So it was kind of, if you'd said, go and get your scrolls to somebody, say, in the 3rd century, my pot of them might have been really quite different from your pot of them. So we've narrowed the range. I mean, just to give an example of that, if you go to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, you can go down into the shrine, and what do you find? Anybody been there? Where did the Nativity take place according to that shrine? In a cave. It took place in a cave. But Matthew implies that the birth took place in a house. Luke tells us that the birth took place in a stable. So we've got 3 possible locations there. Why does that church have the cave?
The time of year that the birth was of Jesus, too, that's a little iffy when you talk about...
Not just iffy, it's completely...
Because the shepherds weren't in the fields in December.
Oh,
Where did it go?
no, December date was one that we stole from the Romans. Yeah, I haven't the faintest idea when Jesus was born, and nobody else does. Yeah, nobody else does. But what I was going to say is the cave comes from the Protevangelium of James. which is a document that was written in the second century, I think, or early third, in which the author tries to resolve the differences between Matthew and Luke accounts with a third account, and it has the birth in a cave. It also has other amazing things, like the fact that, according to it, the Virgin Mary gave birth to Jesus, but she remained an intact virgin, because she's examined by a midwife. Now, that's what virgin birth meant for a lot of people. I find it difficult.
Why did they hate the label for their Bible?
Oh, well, then that raises the question, why did Luke have a stable? And it's a good question. I don't know the answer. No idea.
No room in the inn.
Yeah, no, but I mean, Matthew certainly thinks it was a house, and he thinks that they lived in Bethlehem. Luke thinks that they came for the taxation, a taxation, by the way, from which we have no independent attestations. And John's gospel implies that Jesus came from Nazareth. So you've got, again, an embarrassment of riches that can either trouble you deeply if you want one single thing to be true, but what you might want to do instead is to think about what kind of other truth, mythical truth, say, poetic truth, there is in the different stories. Right off the cuff, I can't come up with 4 different metaphorical truths, but I'm sure the stable means something. Maybe it's that there's an Old Testament passage what the ox knows his master and the ass knows where his cradle is, or where the manger is to be found, or something like that. So it may be that Luke is appealing to that. He's very good at appealing to Old Testament background. So.
I was learning, I just thought it meant it was a very humble place.
Well, and indeed.
To me, the humility of the birthright would be, you expect a king to be in a palace, but no one's
Good.
born in a
You can preach a wonderful sermon on this. And yeah, I mean, it shows you. Again, as I say, I try to think of this variety of things, not as contradictions that trouble me, but as a vast poetic richness to the way in which we talk about something that in the end is massively mysterious and can't be captured by any particular story.
Is there a version of the Bible that makes you happy?
You mean the translations?
Translation, yes.
I don't know about happy, but I like the Revised Standard Version, and I like it for reasons that have to do with being a historian. I think it's the translation that where there's a problem with the text, where you're not sure what the meaning is, it doesn't solve that for you. I think the Good News Bible, I'll say it here and here, get your pistols out. I think it's Bad News Bible, because it doesn't tell you what the words of Scripture say. It tells you what someone thinks they mean. So it solves all the problems by making choices that you might not make if you knew what the original actually said. And let me give you an example of how translators get us in trouble. I was fascinated by, oh, wait a minute. Oh, I'm getting caught up in my own thinking. What example was I going to give? Oh, yeah. In the whole argument about homosexuality, Paul says things about men. And he condemns men who are such and such a word. And it's translated in the Revised Standard Version even, which troubles me, as meaning men who are homosexuals. But the Greek is men who are effeminate. Now, the old translation said effeminate men. Then women's lib came along, or suffragettes, and they said, what's wrong with being feminine? So the translators changed it to homosexual. But if you go back to the ancient world, effeminate and masculine didn't mean what they mean today. Effeminate meant I mean, the absolute reverse of Victorian English way of thinking, where women didn't want sex but men did, which I know is a lie. Maybe both halves are a lie some of the time. So they, I mean, the 19th century thought that to be effeminate would be to not be interested in that kind of thing. But in the ancient world, effeminate meant sensual, as opposed to rational. Male was rational, female was sensual. So that when it was accusing men of being, Paul was talking about effeminate men, he meant men who were really randy. The exact opposite of what the 19th century translators ended up giving us, because they associate effeminacy with people who flounce around the room and, you know, drag queens or something like that. So the problem of translation is really, really tricky one. And I would advise you to read the Revised Standard and look at the footnotes. There's a really interesting one in Galatians 2, where Paul's talking about how he was called. And he says, when he who had set me apart before I was born was pleased to reveal his Son. And then what does it say? Was pleased to reveal his Son to me, is what the English translation says. But the Greek unmistakably says en emoi, in me. And a revelation of the resurrected Christ in me is something I find a great deal easier to believe in than a resurrected Christ who's a resuscitated corpse that everybody else can see. You know, so there's a place where translation is tricky and where we're actually misled by well-meaning translators, preventing us from seeing the difficult text in me. Okay, sir. Is this being useful, by the way, folks? Is this fun? It's fun, of course. I mean, that's the thing. It's exhilarating kind of fun to take the risks, to look at these questions, and quite often to say, I don't know the answer, let's work at that. Work in progress. Sorry, back.
I have a question on resurrected corpse.
Yes.
You just said, one of my hobbies is to study near-death experiences.
Oh, yes. Yeah, you've been reading Tom Harper, or you must know what he writes, anyway. Yeah.
It's a flaky topic.
It is.
Because there are fakes.
Yeah.
And everybody that studies it says that.
Mm-hmm.
So in my looking at it, I only count clinical death experiences.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about them is that about 25% of the ones I've studied have come to in the morgue. So they were very seriously considered dead.
Yeah.
And I have a collection.
I wish I knew where you're going with this. I mean, I know that we're all going to the morgue, but that's, I hope, in the long run.
I have a collection of 30 strong atheists who had clinical death experiences.
Yeah.
And everyone, 92% of them reported going straight to hell. And struggling with panic and terror.
Serve them
falling
right.
on
Serve them
God,
right.
And being converted and coming back.
And do they come back converted?
Yes, 23% of them became pastors.
Wow.
So my question is...
Yeah, I was waiting for this.
Do you believe in a literal hell?
No, of course not.
They do.
I know, and I don't know what to say. I know that one of the things I remember preaching about hell once. Once. Oh! It was a hell of an experience. No, I remember I was walking with a colleague. We'd taken a class from the university to the Holy Land. And we were walking across towards King David's Tower to go into the Old City. And he said, do you realize we're walking through hell?
Hell's Gate.
Well, it was the place where they tossed the garbage down and burned it. So to me, that means, or suggests, a very useful way of thinking about hell, which is, hell is the place where people stop existing because they've been a waste. You know, it's the worst thing you can say about someone, isn't it? Bob Dylan says it, "You just wasted my precious time." You know? Yeah, these are people, they've been brought into existence, they've been put in this glorious world, they've been given all kinds of promise and wonder and grace, and they've frittered the time away, and it's been for nothing. And I think that's what that image of hell is, a place where it's just the garbage got rid of. So if there's a hell, I hope that's what it is, where people can just, if there are people who wasted everybody else's time, they can go and stop.
We need to talk to some of these atheists.
Well, yeah.
Are they still atheists or are they former atheists?
Well, some of
All were converted.
Yeah, so-
all were converted.
92%.
Yeah. You know,
And 8% couldn't tell.
you know, there are just lots of things I will say over and over again, I don't know. I don't know about that. I think I'll wait till my own near-death experience to see. But someone might twist it out a little bit, and then I won't be back to tell you.
Please come back and tell me.
Yeah. No, it's a very interesting kind of body of evidence, and I don't know what to do with it. I know when we talked about Tom Harper's book on this, in the book study group we have at St. Mark's that I run, a woman who's a social worker and has quite a lot of scientific training said, I understand that when you are approaching death, there's certain chemicals that happen and they do blah, blah. And I'm just telling you what she said. And I must say, most of my life I've thought probably it's some neurochemical thing that happens. But then, you know, everything we experience also is a neurochemical event. So I'm getting in a circle. So let's go on to another question. Sorry, sir. Yeah, your hand was up before.
Do our scriptures support or compare with the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Dead Sea Scrolls tell us some things, but nothing directly about our New Testament. They're pretty well written before the New Testament, and they show us that there existed. One of the things they show us, which is really interesting, is that there were multiple kinds of Judaism in the time of Jesus. There were many, many kinds. There were Pharisees, lay movement, creating a kind of Judaism that didn't bother with the temple but emphasized individual righteousness, keeping of the law. There were the Sadducees who were attached to the temple cult, and Judaism was, I mean, here we talk again about how you define a religion. You know, the Pharisees would have said, oh, religion is about how you live your life and follow God's law. And the Sadducees would have said, no, it's how you offer sacrifice and how you worship in the temple, how you support the temple. And there were the Zealots who went around and knifed you if you were cooperating with the Romans. And then there were the Dead Sea people. And they were a community that set itself apart as an ultra-pure sect of Judaism. They had rules about things. They're very strict about sexual things, for instance. People caught masturbating were kicked out, that kind of thing. It was something a bit like a monastic movement. And they were down at the Dead Sea because of a text in Hosea that refers to seems to refer to a time when God's going to create a new Israel out in the desert. So they went out there to do that, thinking that Jerusalem and all those other people, including the high priest and the temple, God's going to destroy all that, and they were going to be the ones that survived. They were an apocalyptic sect. They're like Jonestown or something like that. setting out there. The reason they were destroyed is just that the Romans, when there was the Zealot revolt in 66, and the Jewish people rose up in arms against the Roman occupiers, then the Roman army said, we're not taking this crap, and they came in, and anything that looked as if it could be fortified against them, they leveled, and that included the Qumran community's buildings. So all you've got is this little pattern on the ground of what was once buildings. But it helps us to understand the kind of apocalyptic expectations of some Christian writers. You know, that God's going to come and intervene in this great cosmic way. And again, that shows you different notions of the Messiah that you have. Some people thought the Messiah would just be a political leader. He's going to come and revive the kingship. And others thought he was going to be some divine creature that would come down with thunder and lightning and destroy everybody. And everything in between. So when New Testament writers call Jesus the Christ, meaning the Messiah, don't immediately think it means what you think it means. What does that writer mean by calling him Messiah? Which part of that tradition is that a reference to? Okay. Oh, you haven't asked me any really difficult questions.
Just wanted to get your summary of, you talked about your perception or your evolution of your thinking about the original sin and original
Blessing.
So is there any other significant movements you've had in your research with doctrines?
And one of the things people are often interested in is early Christian teaching about sex, because it has had its powerful influence. And a powerful influence on all the churches in the West is St. Augustine. Now, Augustine had the absolutely wonderful idea, which it's leitmotif for me to this day, that he says, my love is my weight. By it I am drawn wherever I am drawn to. So it's what you love that you follow. That's where you go. And he says, and you made us for yourself, he says to God, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. So it has this wonderful image of us as the lovers seeking God, and God is the object of our love. And so he takes seriously, very seriously, the commandment, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. So his whole life struggle as a Christian was to bring himself to the point where he could love God and be totally absorbed in God and not distracted by anything else. And you get passages where in his sad old age, he's working as a bishop and in this one-horse town of Hippo meaning horse, by the way. Is it 5 minutes? I've got more to say than that, Stephen. Go away. Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to think where I want to go with that then. Oh yeah, so he thinks that everybody should be totally obsessed with loving God. So much so that when he talks about loving your neighbor, he more or less says, well, you love your neighbor as a way of loving God. And I think that's absolutely wrong and something that we should beware of. But on sexuality, in the City of God, he makes everybody worries what was going on in Adam and Eve's bedroom. Okay? Or, yeah, their pile of ferns. Whatever. But, yeah. He says that because of the way he sees that you ought to love God with your whole mind and will and everything, but he says he can't make himself do it. It's like pulling himself up with his own bootstraps. He can't turn his will so that it just loves God. It keeps being distracted. He hears the people riding out to hunt in the horns, and suddenly he's with them. And then he thinks, oh my God, I should be with God. I should be thinking about God. Well, when it comes to Adam and Eve, his concern is that he can't by his will make things happen. And part of the diagnosis of the disease of that unconvertible will is the involuntary sexuality. Men get erections and have nocturnal emissions, and women have, even women, ladies, have lustful thoughts that you don't want to have, but they come up, they just happen. And that's a symptom to him of the disease, of sinfulness, not loving God. So he imagines that Adam and Eve, before the fall, did in fact have sex, but it was sex without passion. Does it sound terrific? Yeah. But this has created all kinds of trouble, this notion that somehow, if there's going to be sex, it should be passionless sex. Men, for one thing, can't do it. And women, when they do it, are not having a lot of fun. But they can do it. They can just submit. And it creates an imbalance in marriage. It creates unfair expectations. Well, there's more to be said about that, but it's a fascinating and troubling thing that it infects. Again, in the Eastern Church, it's quite different. The Eastern Orthodox say no fall. Adam and Eve didn't have sex in paradise, but after they began to go astray and lost natural immortality, remember that's one of the results. The way to the tree of life is closed. So you're not going to live forever anymore. So God actually gives them sex as a gift so that they can reproduce when they die. So the human race won't die out. So in the Eastern Church, you still have monastics, monks, who want to live the life of the angels. That is to live as if they didn't have bodies. And that's terrific. That's a wonderful thing, they think. I have my doubts. But I haven't tried it either. But the life of married people is a God-given alternative. Married, have sex, have children, perpetuate the human race. It's two paths, both of them good, rather than Augustine's sex inevitably in the post-fall situation, it's corrupted by passion and distracts you from God and therefore is a bad thing. And from that we get all kinds of repressive teachings that we're just beginning to escape from, frankly. Okay, does that help? That's not the answer to the question any of you was asking, but there it is. I think Stephen has told me that we can't go on. Thank you very much for being a good audience.